Today we're going to be talking about 5 beginner tips for improving your photography. And these truly are beginner tips. So if you've just gotten your first interchangeable lens camera, or you have an advanced compact camera and you want to stop using your phone for taking photos and you want to learn how to take better photos, this is 5 tips for you. The first tip that I have is to shoot in manual all the time. Now, what does that mean? That means that you set your aperture, your ISO, and your shutter speed to the exposure value that you want before you take a photo. And so what this does is it allows you to understand what is commonly referred to as the exposure triangle. Now, the exposure triangle is similar to the fire triangle, where you need all 3 parts, and depending on certain combinations you get certain effects. So the way the exposure triangle works is its 3 sides are ISO, or ISO, some people pronounce it that way, aperture, and shutter speed. And so the idea is that each of these 3 things determine how much light hits your sensor, basically, is a good way to think about it. The higher your ISO, right, that's how sensitive your sensor is. So if you're shooting, let's say you've got your camera set up and you're shooting a scene. If you shoot it at 100 ISO, it might be very dark. And if you increase your ISO to 800, then the image might come out very bright. Because what you've done is basically told your sensor to pick up smaller amounts of light and to count those values. So as you increase your ISO, your image gets brighter. Obviously, you don't want your image too bright, but you don't want it too dark either. So the second part of the exposure triangle is aperture. And so what aperture is it's how large the opening in the lens is. Basically, as the aperture gets smaller, less and less light can come through, so your image gets darker. The wider open your aperture is, the more light can get in and the brighter your image. Of course, aperture doesn't just affect how light or dark the photo is. The smaller the aperture you're using means that a lot of things are going to be in focus. It increases your depth of field, right? And the wider you use, the more stuff is going to be out of focus. If you've ever seen photos that have a really blurry background where you can really only see the thing that's in focus and everything else is blown out. Also, those blown out areas are referred to as bokeh. So generally speaking, you use a wide aperture to get a lot of bokeh in an image, right? And really separate your subject from the background. Now, one key thing to note about aperture is that the smaller the aperture number is, the wider open the lens is. So if you're at f2, let's say, you have a pretty wide aperture. But if you go to f4, it's going to be smaller, and this is often referred to as stopping down your aperture. Okay, so moving on to the third component of the exposure triangle, shutter speed. So shutter speed obviously is pretty much what it sounds like. It's how fast the shutter of the camera opens and closes. And obviously the longer it's open, the more light that comes into the camera, the brighter your image. The shorter it is, the less light that comes in and the darker your image. Now, a key component to shutter speed is creating motion blur. So if you use a long shutter speed and something's moving through the frame, it's going to blur, because the light that object is reflecting back into your camera is obviously going to change from point to point as you take an image. So if you're shooting something that's fast, like say sports or wildlife, and you want a sharp picture of your subject, now there are cases where you may want to use a longer shutter speed for a creative effect. But generally speaking, if you're shooting something fast moving, you want to use a short shutter speed, which on most cameras is going to be a larger number, so because they're 1 over that. So 1/500th of a second is often represented as 500, just for simplicity. So the faster your shutter speed, the more you're able to stop that action immediately, right? And to get a crisp, sharp picture. So those are the three sides of the exposure triangle. Okay, so with that out of the way, shooting manual will allow you to understand the exposure triangle and how to get the image you want to get, right? What effect does aperture have? What shutter speed? By being in manual, it allows you to fiddle with those things so that you better understand them. And so I always recommend, especially if you're starting out, that you shoot almost exclusively in manual until you really understand what all those settings do, and then you can start using the semi-automatic and automatic modes, because even though modern automatic modes are very good, they're not as bad as they used to be, they still might not be right for you. So you may want motion blur. You may want to take a shot of, say, a basketball court with the players running around where there's a little bit of motion blur. And so you would need a longer shutter speed. But the camera is going to think, I should have a really, really fast shutter speed. And so obviously the automatic modes are not always going to give you the effect that you want. Moving on to the second tip, and my second tip is a little bit more difficult now that everybody's quarantined and, generally going out's not something that you can do. And that second tip is to shoot every day. And it doesn't quite matter what you shoot. Obviously, shoot something that you want to shoot, but you should also shoot things maybe that are happening around you. So let's say you walk to work, or you're going through a stroll in the park. Take your camera with you. Not that you're guaranteed to get a photo, but if the more you shoot, the better you get. Obviously, practice makes perfect. So the more often you have your camera on you, and the more often you're looking for photos, the more you're going to find. And so it'll enable you to start taking photos and start thinking about, okay, so, I really like how this street portrait turned out, or I really like how, I got this picture of my dog running through the backyard or something like that, right? It doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be an award-winning photo, right? The idea is to take more photos, and especially take more photos in manual mode, and so you get a feel for the effect that different settings on the camera can have. So moving on to number 3, which is related to shooting every day. So just because you shoot every day, that's good. You need to take more photos, but you need to also process those photos. And so you need to establish a workflow. And so when we talk about establishing a workflow, that's not just I take a photo and I edit it, right? Most people would probably describe this as defining your style, right? But basically is taking those photos that you shot and editing them so that they look good to you, right? That's kind of the key thing is you really shouldn't be trying to edit them so that they look like somebody else's. That's a good exercise every once in a while, but you really want to develop your own style. So what you want to do is you want to edit those photos to where they look good for you, and then save them, maybe post them to Instagram or whatever you want to do with them, right? But the key is getting them in and editing them. For me personally, I recommend posting them somewhere like Instagram or Facebook. Obviously, they're not the best, yes, all of my professional photos are on Instagram. Some of them are. But the idea should be that what you want to do is have an end goal, basically. So it helps to be like, okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is import, and then I'm going to edit, and I'm going to do these changes, right? I'm going to put it around, maybe this much contrast and this much saturation, right? Get a style, and then publish the photo somewhere, because if you don't, you may end up feeling like you don't kind of have any sort of endpoint, right? So why should I edit my photos today? It's not like I'm going to put them anywhere, right? They're just going to sit there. So then you have hard drives full of raw files that are just sitting there and not being used and not being edited, and you really want to establish that workflow, and that will get you not only better at getting photos out the door, but also better at editing, because again, the key is to just practice, right? And to combine 2 and 3, I recommend doing something like Instagram 365, where the goal is to shoot a photo each day. It doesn't have to be your best work, you should still be proud of it. Don't like take a picture of the wall or 365 selfies. Vary it up a little bit. But take a photo that day, edit it that day, and then upload it to Instagram. Or if your schedule doesn't allow that, maybe, today I take 2 photos, but I can't take a photo tomorrow because whatever reason, right? It's about making sure that there's that end goal, and it gets you into, okay, this is what I need to do, this is how I do this, and I can process a photo in a relatively quick amount of time rather than sitting there fiddling with knobs for, an hour to get half a photo done. Okay, so moving on to number 4. Change what you're shooting. So a lot of beginners, myself included when I started, you shoot the same thing over and over and over again. And while that's kind of good, you don't want to be shooting the same thing all the time. And this is not just the same subject. This is, shooting only landscapes or shooting only street photography or shooting only portraits. It's good that you like doing one thing, but you really need to branch out, right? Before you can really like specialize on something, you kind of have to play the field, right? Obviously, not everything that you learn shooting landscapes and practicing shooting landscapes is going to transfer over to street photography or to portraits, because they're different domains of photography. But knowing how to shoot anything will obviously help you shoot everything. So the idea is kind of a rising tide raises all boats, where by shooting other things, you can learn to get to know your camera better. You can get to know how to do certain things. Like, for example, in portrait photography, you are probably rarely ever going to do something like a sky replacement, right? But that is a common technique used in landscape photography. And it's a good thing to have in your toolbox when you need to use something like it, right? Because there might be a portrait shoot where you need to replace that sky with something better. So it's just good to have, right? So that's number 4, is, change what you shoot and shoot a lot of different things, obviously. And then the last one is to re-edit your old photos. Obviously, if you're just starting out, you're not going to have old photos yet, right? You don't have that many photos to begin with, probably. But you need to go back and edit your old photos. And I find this helps me as well, because it shows you the progress that you've made, right? I have some really god-awful photos that I took when I was just starting out and edited, and I was like, oh yeah, this is cool, it's like so saturated, and no. So, it's a good idea to go back and re-edit your old photos, A, to show you that, I've gotten better, and B, to show how your style has changed over time, right? So you can kind of understand the progression that you're going through, and it really is encouraging when you go back and read an old photo that either you thought, this is the greatest thing ever, and then realized it wasn't, or something that you said, this is a completely unusable photo, but now you have the techniques to, say, recover the bad exposure and, maybe replace the sky and make it look better. I know I'm harping on about sky replacement, something I really don't even like that much. Anyway, point being is that by re-editing your old photos, you may be able to recover good photos that you took that you didn't realize were good at the time, or more importantly, be able to take photos that you thought were good at the time, understand why they're not so good now, and then edit them so that they're now where you would like them to be. Okay, so this has been just a short video of 5 tips for beginner photographers. And again, I must emphasize, really, beginner photographers. So if you like the video, don't forget to like and maybe leave your own tips down below in the comments. And feel free to subscribe. All right, thanks. See you.